Finally, it's time to make a new InDesign document. The way to make a new InDesign document is to go to the File menu and then choose Document from the new submenu. Of course, you could also just press Command-N on the Mac or Control-N on Windows. Up comes the New Document dialog box, and at first, this dialog box might be a little overwhelming. There are a number of features in here that you probably don't need to pay attention to all the time, but still, I'm going to go through them one feature at a time just to make sure you know what's in here. The very first thing you need to decide on is the intent. The Intent pop-up menu lets you tell InDesign where this document is going. Where's your intention for this document? And there are three options here: print, web, and digital publishing. I need to point out that web is a bit of a misnomer. It does not mean web like a web page or an HTML page. It means a document that is going to be delivered on screen. This really should be called on screen. An example of this might be a document that you're going to be exporting as a PDF, and maybe it has a movie in it or some buttons, things that will probably only be seen on screen, maybe occasionally printed out. Another example might be a SWIFT file, Flash. Maybe it has animations built into it. Those are on-screen documents. Now, two things happen when you choose web. First, all your measurements are set to pixels instead of picas or inches or centimeters or whatever. Second, all your colors in your document will be set to RGB. Now, that's appropriate for a web or an on-screen document. On the other hand, digital publishing is very different. Digital publishing is for documents that are destined to be used in the Digital Publishing Suite, otherwise known as Adobe DPS. And that's for documents that are going to be created as apps on some sort of tablet, like an iPad or an Android device. If you choose that, still all your measurements are set to pixels, but one thing you'll notice is that the page size is no longer set to a dimension, it's set to a name. It's a device. For example, is this going to an iPad or an iPhone or maybe a Kindle Fire? InDesign is smart enough to know the pixel dimensions of those various devices. That said, for all the other InDesign documents, probably 99% of the documents that are created with InDesign around the world, you want to choose an intent of print. Print does not mean only print. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be printing this. If you're making a PDF that you're putting up on your website for somebody to read, maybe like a product sheet for some business, you can still use print. Print is kind of like the catch-all for all the other documents that you're going to be creating. Now, when you use print, your measurements are all set to picas or inches or centimeters or whatever you've chosen, and all your colors are set to CMYK. Of course, you can later add other colors that are not CMYK, and I'll talk about that in a later chapter. The next thing you need to decide in the New Document dialog box is whether your document is set up for facing pages. Facing pages should only be used for documents that have a left-hand and a right-hand page, a verso and a recto, like a book or a magazine. If you're doing a one-page flyer or maybe a double-paged brochure or something, you want to turn that off. Anything that does not truly have facing pages, turn it off. Now, the next checkbox down is Primary Text Frame. And this is used for things like books, where you have a story that goes from one page to the next over a lot of pages. Primary Text Frame will automatically add a text frame to your master pages. I'm going to be covering this in a later chapter, but for now, I'm just going to tell you that most people can turn that off and just leave it off. A couple of other features we can look at quickly. Number of pages. That's usually set to 1, but if you know that you're creating a document with, say, 16 pages, you can type 16 in here, and you'll get 16 pages. But it doesn't really matter, and honestly, I usually leave it set to 1 because I can add pages later when I need them. Same thing with Start Page. Start Page is something you can set here if you want to. For example, say you're working on a chapter of a book, and you know that chapter starts on page 47, well, you could set that right here if you want. Otherwise, you don't have to. It's easy to change later, and I'll show you how in a later chapter. So now we get to the real meat and bones of this dialog box, the page size. This is the most important thing you can choose here. What size should the finished piece be? Now, I'm talking about if you're going to be printing this on a commercial printing press, what is the final size after it's trimmed down going to be? Is it letter size? Is it 8 by 10? Is it something smaller? If you're printing a business card, you should choose Business Card out of this pop-up menu, and the width and the height will update automatically. Or if you know you're printing on A4 paper, then go ahead and choose A4. In this case, I'm going to create a document size that's not listed here. So I'll click off this pop-up menu, and I'm going to make it a 7-inch by 9-inch document. I'll select the width field, and I'll type 7IN. That's for 7 inches. Then I'll hit Tab, and you'll notice that InDesign automatically updates the width field. It converts that measurement into the current measurement system, which is picas. This document is going to be 9 inches tall, so I'll type 9IN and then press Tab again, and InDesign converts it to picas for me. If you want to, you can also click these orientation buttons over on the right. All these do is literally swap the values in the width and the height fields. It doesn't do anything special. Now, I should point out that sometimes it's difficult to visualize the size of the page when you're working in numbers. Fortunately, there's a preview checkbox in the lower left corner of this dialog box. If I turn on preview, InDesign appears to be creating a document for me, but it's just temporary. If I click cancel, the document will go away. But this is a great way to get a visual sense of my document. I'm going to move my new document dialog box out of the way a little bit, and I can see that when I change the orientation from portrait to landscape, InDesign shows that to me on screen. That's really helpful. I'll go back to portrait, and now I'm going to jump over to the columns field. Most documents just have one column, but if you know that you're going to have 2 or more columns in your document, go ahead and change it here. I could just type a number in here, but I'm just going to click this little up arrow button to change that 1 to a 2. The gutter amount is the amount of space in between each column of your document. So for example, if I want to add more space between the columns, I could change it here. Let's say 2 picas instead. And now margins. I need to be clear here, margins are just guidelines. There's nothing stopping you from putting objects outside the margins, but margins are helpful reminders of where you should put your text frames and graphic frames and so on. One thing to note here is this little button in the middle. It looks like a little chain. Right now, if I made a change to any of these fields, let's say I change my margins to 2 picas instead, and I hit Tab, you'll notice that all of those fields are linked together. So they all change to 2 picas. But what if I want one of those margins to be different than the others? No problem, I just click that button and it decouples or unlinks those fields. So if I change the top field to something like 6 picas and then hit Tab, you'll see that that changes independently of the others. Now there's a little bit more to this dialog box, and it's kind of hiding from you, but if I click on this little triangle next to bleed and slug, up comes even more features. I guess Adobe didn't want to freak you out by offering too many options at the same time. I'm going to be talking about these bleed and slug settings in a later movie in this chapter. I just wanted to point out that this is where you can find those settings here in this dialog box. The last thing I want to point out about the new document dialog box is at the very top, and that's the Save Document Preset button. This is really helpful when you create a lot of new documents because some of those documents are probably going to have the same values, the same page size, margins, and so on. So I can save all the work that I've just done in this dialog box by clicking the Save Preset button and giving it a name. You can call it anything you want. I'm just going to call it 7x9 with 6 pica top. Now I'll click OK, and you can see that next time I need a document with those settings, I just pull it right out of my Document Preset pop-up menu. Then I'll click OK, and I'm good to go. There's the document. After you create your document, you might realize that you need to make changes. Don't panic. InDesign is very flexible, very forgiving. For example, let's say you want to change the size of the page slightly. Okay, we'll go to the File menu and choose Document Setup. We can change all sorts of settings here, including the page size. For example, let's say we want to make this a little bit taller. I'll change this from 54 picas up to 55 picas. And then click OK. And you can see that the document is now slightly taller. Making a new document with the proper settings is the first step in creating a strong foundation for your publication.